I mean, J.P. Rushton is basically the perfect scientist, right? I mean, listen to that response. Someone was trying to say, it's unethical for you to do the science. And what are you going to use that science for anyway? And his response is nothing. My job is as a scientist. I'm not a politician. I don't make policy recommendations. I just do the science. I am totally unbiased. My incentives are completely aligned for science. I'm not pushing a political thing. This is 180 the opposite of how the social sciences operate in modern university. In modern universities, it is the exact opposite. The only reason grants are given in the social sciences is to advance some political agenda that they need an academic rubber stamping on, that they need a study done to provide the evidence for. Some government initiative by politicians or some corporate initiative, and they need some social study rubber stamp, so they commission some academics and pay them grant money. It's pure politics. This is the only honest science. You are looking at Galileo. And when I say that, I'm not fucking with you. I'm not joking. There's no hyperbole here. This man is Galileo. When we win, in the generations to come, this man, you're looking at Galileo's trial. J.P. Rushton.
In my opinion. And that does and will have probably policy implications. But you have to go and ask economists and educators and ethicists and politicians what to do about it, because I don't have any recommendations. I'm just simply, if I have any recommendation at all, it is to the effect that we really must, it's about time, after 120 years since Charles Darwin, it's about time that we human beings accepted that we are another form of animal life on this planet, and that there will be a lot of genetic variance within us, which is the first fundamental postulate of Darwinian theory, is that there's genetic variance. The second postulate is that some of that variance is more successful at getting itself replicated than other parts of the variance. That's evolution. So Darwin's theory at that level is quite easy to understand conceptually. And what I'm saying is that when you look at humans, you've just got to come to terms with the view that there is enormous biological diversity, and we just have to accept that. That's the message.
I think Dr. Suzuki pointed out one big thing, that there was a larger variance within each race than between the races itself, and I think that's the big...
Yeah, that's because there's an absolutely enormous amount of in-group variance, right? It's the same thing with lions, right? There's big lions, there's small lions. Same thing with dogs. There's big dogs and little dogs. But there's also substantial differences between them. It doesn't... See, this is the thing. You always have to take it back to the fact, at least in my view, and this is why I talk about the heart right. Honestly, there are a lot of Hispanic people who write to me, who are allies, and they're familiar with HBD principles. And you judge everybody as an individual. I don't have any hate in my heart. But the main thing is, you just can't blame everything on racism. You cannot use racial communism and identity politics as a political cudgel. And you cannot have policies that wrongly ascribe racism to the root cause. Boom. There's your implications of the science for policy.
Biggest point that had to be made.
And that may or may not be true depending upon which measures you take. And I don't think that's a...
I think that should be obvious.
I don't think that's a settled
when you
matter at
calculate
all.
means, you should be able to come up with variances pretty simply.
Well, variance depends on what.
The average Japanese height is 5'4". The average height of people who live in Amsterdam of the Dutch is 6 feet. Do you think that might be useful knowledge to know? Must we deliberately dumb ourselves?
Measures you're measuring. I mean, if you're taking regulator genes, or whether you're taking nuclear genes or whatever, you get different amounts of variance. If you take IQ test scores, or whether you take on one test or IQ test scores on a different test, you get different amounts of variance. That's not. But look, I take the point without any question, and let me reiterate it, that there is enormous variation within each of the three major racial groups, and along with all other subgroups within those major groups. And I don't think you can generalize from one group to another, from one group to an average individual. I would like to say that I am not a racist. I believe that a racist is a person who will treat all members of a group the same, and usually also to try to deprive them of their civil liberties in some way. I'm not advocating and do not believe in anything of that nature, so I think I've answered the question.
We'll now take a question from Mike.
It's a healthy applause.
Professor Rushton, you said that you're not a racist, but quite frankly, I think you are one hiding under academic freedom. The Globe and Mail, printed Saturday, February 4th, quoted you, and I read, "Let's face it, that's what blacks do, ask for special treatment. We've had to change everything in educational system and professional schools to make sure blacks did not fail in large numbers. But if we accept the alternative arguments that blacks aren't as intelligent, then what we have done is lower the standards to allow more in." I mean, quite frankly, I'm very offended by that statement. I mean, in school, most of my friends here, and a lot that we know, achieve higher than others around us. And I'd like you to answer to what standards have been lowered for us blacks to be here.
Boy, thank you very much for asking that question. I am very happy. Let me just put that into context and I'll answer specifically. That is from the Globe and Mail. It was written by a man called Stephen Strauss, who is the science reporter for the Globe and Mail. He is a man that I've read and admired, and I think he's a good science reporter. And that was a scurrilous piece of work that he published, because what he did was to interview me for about an hour and a half or 2 hours in San Francisco before, in fact, I presented the paper. He interviewed me for about an hour and a half on the telephone here in London, and another 20 minutes subsequently. I gave him as much time as I did because he was a Globe and Mail, because I respected him and so on. And in fact, the first paper he published on me was written about 5 days before that. And then, for reasons I have no idea, I phoned him at his home, the only person I've ever complained to about it. I phoned him up and complained about that, because what he did in that article was, in fact, to take sections out of a paper, sections out of a discussion we had in San Francisco, and put it next to a discussion we had on something else an hour later, and then put it next to something that we had about 3 weeks later, as though I'd strung those 3 or 4 pieces together. And so that was just one example of, okay, now, the context of that particular quotation, which is, "Let's face it, that's what blacks do, isn't it?" is this, that I said, look, if I came to you, if I was a black man, and I came to you and I said, look at these statistics, look at breakups of marriages, look at black crime rates, look at black suicide, look at black alcoholism and drug abuse and so on, look at poor educational attainment, look at school dropouts. And black people do this, and they say, look at this, this is proof of a racist society that we are living in. And indeed, this is good evidence that we've got to do something about it. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States has more or less used that kind of evidence, what they call adverse effect, I believe it's called, as evidence for either affirmative action programs or alleviation of suffering, Head Start programs, and a whole range of social programs. So my point to Strauss was that, of course, that's what blacks do. They use these statistics and interpret them one way, quite reasonably. I'm taking exactly the same statistics, adding in a lot of other variables, but interpreting it to genetic and evolutionary mechanisms, and that is what people are finding completely unacceptable. So I stand by the argument. I do not remotely stand by the context in which that scurrilous piece of work appeared.
Well, primarily this is Globe and Mail, and this is in Canada. And I would still, you have not answered it. These are all your words, even though they may have been taken out of the context. The fact is that you still said them. And what I'm trying to ask is,
think about that for a second. Sorry, actually, this is just too dumb. It's too easy. I'm gonna let it play, guys. There's a fair amount left in this. Maybe let me know in the chat if you guys are having fun with this, or if you want me to fast forward. But this is the IRL comment section of this debate, and
in what ways have standards been lowered?
Not high quality,
especially in Canada, because we're here right now, so that blacks can get into our schools and professional systems.
My stand has been consistently not to comment on policies. You can come up to me and say, what do you think about South Africa? What do you think about immigration? What do you think about the school system? What do you think should be done about crime? What do you think about person X or person Y or current event Z? And I just say, look, I'm not in the business of making recommendations, policies. I don't endorse, I don't condemn. I'm here simply, believe it or not, to try to explain what I think is a very interesting pattern of data. And that's so I can't comment on...
You're saying you don't comment on policy whatsoever, but what I just read are your own words. And I mean, so if you don't comment on policies, then you shouldn't be making comments such as what you've made. And, secondly...
They're applauding for him saying, if you don't make comments on policy, you shouldn't make comments on science. I mean, this is Galileo stuff. J.P. Rushton is Galileo. If you don't make comments on God, you shouldn't make comments on science. And diversity is God. That's where we're at. In 1989, 30 years ago. So, remember, when you hear these things about, and I mentioned this on the Gab stream earlier before I connected to YouTube. It's often you hear these, these alt-light PJW stuff. These like, PJW knockoffs who are like, racism is so, the word racism is so overused nowadays. People call everybody racist nowadays. Nowadays, anything you do is always called racist, and the left has just gone too far. It's been this way since 1957. It's been this way since the Detroit riots in the 50s. It's been this way. It's not a nowadays thing. This debate was 30 years ago. You have to get past your point and sputter. You have to get past the shock. And you have to start thinking in terms of power dynamics. It's the only thing that works.
Okay. I listened to you in a talk show a couple weeks ago, and considering the paper that you've written, and you're going around saying you're not a racist, you had several opportunities in which you could have set people straight. For instance, a lady called in saying how she agreed with you, and then making reference, after all, we wouldn't have dogs and cat. Our dogs and cat do not intermix, so why should humans? I mean, you not being a racist could at least, without making a policy statement, could go, well, at least, different kind of dogs do interbreed if you want to go that far. But you said nothing. And for you to go around saying you're not a racist, I think you have to draw the line and clear people up rather than let them go around with racist comments.
That is the silence is violence guy before that line was cool by SJWs.